It's my pleasure to introduce our guest from South Africa, from the University of Witwatersrand and the Landmark Foundation, Jeannine McManus.
Hi, everybody. Really great to be up here with y'all. I'm going to be talking about a paper that came out last year. So this is the species I work on at home. Leopards predominantly. It's a nice charismatic carnivore that grabs a lot of attention, similar to what the wolves do up here. But it's really just a poster boy for biodiversity. And besides them being awesome. So I work for a small NGO called Landmark Foundation, and I'm busy doing my PhD at WITS at the moment. We had a look at what the best way to manage livestock predation is, whether using lethal control or non-lethal controls. And we basically just assessed which is more economically viable and which reduces livestock losses better. And this is the problem. This is the problem that exists not just in South Africa, but globally. Farmers are telling us that the reason they are not going to tolerate carnivores is because of the economic damage that they cause to their livestock production farms. And it's a valid point. I mean, at the bottom slide there, you can see what's called surplus killing, which is very rare, but it's when an animal takes out a number of individuals during one capture and doesn't eat much of it. So it can be incredibly frustrating for farmers. So human-caused mortality is often driven by these economic costs. And it's not just a localized thing. In the USA, you're reported to be losing about $40 million to predation every year. Bhutan loses about 2/3 of their livestock production, Serengeti 20%, and South Africa, there's a huge discrepancy in the number, but between 22 and $171 million are lost to carnivore predation each year. So that number does give us an indication that we don't know the true sort of accounting of how much is lost to carnivores, but it does tell us that we perceive it to be very high. So human mortality of carnivores contributes to extinction more than any other factor. So theoretically, if we can just combat this economic problem, we can combat carnivore conservation in an ideal world. So if we can just reverse the economic impacts, we've got a solution to the problem. Most livestock farms in South Africa, and I think elsewhere around the world too, rely on lethal controls to reduce depredation. These controls include poisons, gin traps, and shooting, mostly of which are indiscriminate. Poisons sort of walked out the door in South Africa in the mid-1990s. However, it's made quite a staunch reappearance with the price of mohair being sort of skyrocketed to the highest it's ever been before currently in South Africa. Leg hold traps are prolific. We collected about 200 off 12 different farms alone, so it's quite a gauntlet out there. And of course, hunting and shooting is considered to be slightly more discriminant, but it is species targeted, and it's not individually targeting one individual or those individuals that are causing livestock damage. So it's basically going out there and sanitizing the area of the species. They are indiscriminate tools. Just looking at one farm in Victoria West in South Africa, there was a vet that visited a farm, and out of 36 animals that were killed by gin traps, 45% were non-target species at all. 22% were target species, which is, in our case, jackal and caracal, but they were predators that hadn't caused livestock damage at the stage when they were caught. There were also non-culprit predators, and in the bottom left corner, that is an aardwolf, directly translated to an earth wolf. It's related to hyenas, but it doesn't eat mammals at all. It's actually got a very brittle jaw structure. They eat about 250,000 termites a night. They're insectivorous. And then about 8%, so 3 out of the 36 animals caught actually had livestock remains in their stomachs. So, you know, what we're doing to biodiversity with using these controls is crippling. Are they effective at reducing depredation? Apparently not. If you speak to or read some of the papers that are out, depredation is reportedly higher now than it's ever been before, and it's increasing. So all of these inadequacies are forcing us to have a look at other production methods. So we consider ideal controls at being effective at reducing predation for a prolonged period of time, not just a brief stint. It needs to be target-specific on the individuals that are actually causing damage, and it should have a very low ecological impact. Practical social elements are also incredibly important to consider. But non-lethal controls aren't sort of the silver bullet or perfect on its own. They're perceived to be very expensive and perceived to be less effective than lethal controls. And some of these tools can be just as debilitating to ecological processes. And in South Africa, everything's fenced off. In 1910, due to carnivore predation on livestock, the government subsidized for fencing to be taken place across the entire country, and so migrations and the movement of animals and biodiversity were impeded completely. And then of course livestock guarding dogs can be tricky to manage, and they have their own sort of ongoing management implications. So none of these are sort of silver bullets and perfect world solutions. So we had to ask, were non-lethal controls economical? Were they effective at reducing depredation? And would farmers even use them at all? We tried 3 different controls. Then the top corner there, that sheep has got a mesh epoxy collar on. They're quite rigid, and it basically just prevents an animal from taking a bite out of the neck, and all of the carnivores that we have generally go for the neck to make the kill. Then the livestock guarding dogs and alpacas were tested. It was a 3-year study whereby in the first year lethal controls were continued to be used on the farms, and then subsequently replaced with the non-lethal controls for 2 years. We did carcass inspection courses with the researchers and the farmers. We estimated that the value of livestock at that stage was about $161 per head. And we basically just got a lot of information with interviewing the farmers. This is right down the southeastern corner of Africa. Those black dots is where the farms took part in the study. And the carnivores present on these farms included black-backed jackal in the north and then leopards in the more mountainous southern areas. And the lethal controls that had taken place were, in all cases, gin traps and hunting, and then in some cases poisons were also present. Those were replaced with alpacas, guarding dogs, and collars. Now, the results were really quite fascinating. When lethal controls were used, it costed about $3.30 per head of livestock to run and maintain. In the first year of non-lethal control, because you have the capital costs of employing these new methods, it remained about the same. And by the second year of non-lethal control, that decreased down to about 50 cents per head of livestock. So that was significant. The depredation costs during lethal controls were high. They were about $20 per head. That decreased significantly to $6.50 per head by the end of the first year of non-lethal control. And that remained more or less the same during the second year of non-lethal control, decreasing insignificantly. So overall, by the end of the first year, 10 of the 11 farms had cost savings. One farm, which is farm 10 here, didn't spend very much money on hunting, so his costs actually increased by the end of the first year, but it was an insignificant increase. And by the end of the second year, 74% overall was saved in total cost. So really quite interesting to see, and we weren't expecting those sorts of results. Looking at the depredation across the farms during lethal controls and in the first year of non-lethal control, there was a consistent decline across each and every one of the farms. And that remained more or less the same in the second year of non-lethal controls, except for Farm 9, which were using collars, which had an insignificant increase. But maybe that's the beginning of the end for collars' efficacy, indicating that these tools need to be adapted fairly constantly. But 2 years is a good going. This I found fascinating, was that whether you're using guarding dogs, alpacas, or collars, all of these tools had the same trend in that there was a decline in depredation. So this really pushes to the paradigm where, should I be controlling predators or should I just be managing livestock? And this speaks to that. It doesn't really seem to matter which tool you use. So the cost benefits, you're looking at about for every $1 spent, there was a $2 saving by the end of non-lethal control year 1. And during the second year, it increased to $5 for every dollar spent. So that was interesting. What does the literature tell us about existing lethal control studies on the rates of depredation? There's a desperate need for more information on this sort of thing. But basically, between 2 and 68% of depredation was decreased when lethal controls were used. Now, these are intensive lethal controls, and it's ongoing and extremely expensive. By the end of 3 months, often depredation would be back at the same rate as before. And so you'd have to reinstitute these controls. So helicopter hunting, for example, so aerial gunning, it's $6,000 for 2 hours and $15,000 for 6 hours. It's an enormous amount of money going in. And sorry, these are wild hogs or something. I couldn't find the picture with wolves, but it does happen in South Africa with aerial gunning at a large scale. So, if you have a look at the findings with the use of non-lethal controls, the depredation savings were more or less the same on the upper end of compared to the lethal control findings, but it didn't cost nearly as much, and it had a life of about 2 years of reducing livestock losses. So it's not sort of rocket science if you have a look at these figures at the end of the day, but if you have to look at the caveats of the study, we didn't have a control site where one farm was using lethal controls throughout. And environmental conditions may have influenced the depredation declines because it's quite difficult to monitor those sorts of things at quite a large scale. And perhaps lethal controls themselves had wiped out carnivores previously. However, did it happen on all of these farms? 8 of the farms were surrounded by protected areas where predators aren't, or nothing is hunted in protected areas in South Africa. So there's there's a high chance of these animals rippling back out onto farms, and there were no unusual environmental conditions. 13 months, so it was very difficult to maintain letting farmers keep on using these controls. After 13 months, farmers were using about 55 of the farmers were using non-lethal controls, and that reduced to 36% after the research on this project had stopped. 27% combined lethal and non-lethal controls, increasing to 46% over the 2-year mark, and 18% of them went back to only lethal controls. So there's a definite need for institutions to sort of provide these tools to farmers. Interestingly enough, 100% of them said that they were willing to pay for non-lethal controls if it was going to reduce depredation. However, 18% of them actually stood up to that point at the end. One farmer actually wanted to get paid to use non-lethal controls. So farmers definitely need initial support to implement these methods, and they need the ongoing support. But 46% of them remained using non-lethal controls without support. So that's a huge factor. So even if we just implement this once at a large scale, perhaps there's some indication that for at least a short period of time, a few years, it will get taken up more and more. But ultimately, you do need extension services to initiate and sort of take the farmer by the hand and really walk through the process with them. So in summary, non-lethal controls were significantly cheaper to maintain. They had fewer losses. Obviously, the ecological benefits would be present. We didn't monitor any biodiversity changes. It was also a very sort of short-term period. So you need a longer-term study to see how long are these tools going to be effective for. We also just used one tool per farm, and so combining these tools is probably more important in a realistic livestock farming situation. But this kind of information is important for damage-causing animal policies and acts and legislation. It can contribute, and James mentioned, buffer zones and reducing edge effects. These are tools that could be used in those areas, just to buy some time at very least for those populations. But it isn't economically driven. Initially the farmers tell us it's only economical, but really there's a huge social drive and need for people to hunt carnivores, and that can't be ignored. And it was really great to hear Alex's talk yesterday. Having that sociology side of things incorporated into our work is fundamental here. So what do we do next? We've got science that isn't being considered in policy. Carnivore management is being driven by perception, cultural constraints to these alternative methods, and a poor history of science. So what do consumers and public know about these production practices? In South Africa, and this was only in Cape Town, 18% of 2,000 consumers know that farming practices do use lethal controls to reduce depredation, but they didn't think that it would affect any other animals. So we don't know the consumers simply don't know the situation. And this is carnivore conservation. This is, the Sunday roast and the nice woolly jerseys we wear during winter. So we have to start speaking to these factors if policy and everything else isn't coming to hand. The next slide is a little bit disturbing, just bear with me. But in South Africa, this farmer got the highest price for mohair in 2011, and these are his production practices. So bringing that to the fore, as contentious an issue as it is, becomes vitally important, so that you can start supporting farmers that are using ethical production practices, giving them the recognition that they need, and getting it to the consumer, to letting them be able to make that decision. Economically, we have to try and do it this way if nothing else is working. Certainly the science has to continue going, and that's a fantastic sort of interesting side of things. But, we collected about 200 gin traps from 12 farms, and we symbolically burnt them and got everybody involved. And we ended up making sort of an ambassador for them. So, you can turn this into quite a positive side of things. And this leopard goes to different art galleries across South Africa. And slowly it's sort of gaining momentum. But ultimately, we need to use all the avenues available to achieve predator conservation. And I need to applaud the organizers of the event here. Because to have so many diverse sort of groups, the senators yesterday, the policymakers, the legal side of things, the advocacy campaigners, we all have to work together here to achieve our very similar goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeannine. Let's take one question, since I'll need to switch the computer anyway. Thank you.
Would anybody like a question? Lisa?
I'm curious about the reason for the decline in use of the non-lethal. Is it possibly peer pressure from neighbors that are skeptical or resentful about this experiment?
Yes, the social implications with neighbours is definitely something to be considered and known. But it was also, we stopped sort of visiting the area. I carried on with other work, and the farmers started, if they shared their livestock, they wouldn't replace the collars, that sort of thing. So maintaining the research over this period of time became impossible. Definitely the social implications, but also importantly, if you're not involved often enough with those farmers, they will tend to use other methods.